She's done it basically like she has to stay present to people. She's like for the committee because of it. She did. Like you start asking her like what is this or during the calls or whatever. She's gonna be like, hey, it's me, remember my face. This is me. Here are the people going Yeah, no, I saw a friend of mine doing it in the sciences. It's like 8 months of his life.
Okay, let's get started. Hi everyone, gives me a real pleasure to welcome you all today to this great event. I'm Balakrishnan Rajagopal. I teach in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and I also am part of this network called Displacement Research and Action Network. And first of all, I want to thank the students who are in this network who helped put this wonderful event together. Rachel, Leo, Claire, and Alison. Thank you. So first, some logistics. One is food will be arriving, but it's going to get there only towards the end of the event, so that everybody can stay and listen to the event, and then, of course, enjoy your food at the end of the event. We also wanted to announce at this event that the Displacement Network, which we started here as a network that brings together activists, academics, and policymakers from across the globe, including the United States, to look at increasing instances of displacement and to understand the drivers of displacement. Why is it happening in such large numbers, and what are we doing, or what do we know about these people who are displaced, and what are the policy and legal framework that are in place that are supposed to respond to these displacement? And are they working, are they not working? If so, could they be improved? So we're very interested in very practical things, but we want to actually look at it with a perspective about, what displacement is and what's causing it, and to develop some theory about it. So there is a series of research questions about what unites displacement in the United States with displacement in Brazil, for example, or India, or China, or are there such fundamental differences that we cannot, they're all apples and oranges. That's one part of what we're interested in. The research network also involves a series of activities. You can check out those activities in the resources we have. The website address is displacement.mit.edu. And one of the things we will be doing in the next few days is to launch a new blog that actually looks at displacement from a variety of different perspectives. So I wanted to sort of give you a little advance notice about that. And we welcome your participation and your active engagement with the issues from different countries, from different perspectives. The second thing I wanted to say was that gentrification as a process in looking at displacement, to try to understand gentrification is somewhat rare. Typically, displacement is associated with large spectacular events, whether it's the Olympics in Brazil or a large tsunami that displaces a large number of people in Asia and so on. But gentrification is one of those processes which often are not thought of in terms of displacement. It's a large spectacular thing, because it's so slow and it happens over a long period of time. But what we have going on right now are processes like these that are happening in increasing intensity around the world, where it may be slow, but the numbers are getting bigger and bigger. And it may be more invisible because it's not so spectacular, but the consequences are as dramatic. And the impact on the people who are displaced are actually often as profound in terms of the impact on their health and their well-being and their poverty and a range of other issues. So we hope that by focusing attention on displacement and gentrification, we can highlight attention on some of the structural ways in which displacement is happening, not simply in spectacular ways. So we have a terrific panel here to help us work our way through this today. And to share this, I'm really delighted and honored to have with us Professor Larry Vail, my colleague here in Department of Urban Studies and Planning, who's a former chair of the department, a distinguished urban historian, and a scholar of urban politics and design. He teaches here and has, among other things, published a recent book whose title, of course, should tempt you to buy it, Purging the Poorest. Gives you a sense of the kind of work that he does. He's deeply interested in comparative dimensions and what actually, for example, leads to spectacular forms of displacement. Places like Brazil. He has recently written a good paper looking at displacement caused by Olympics, a range of different Olympic events, which I would certainly encourage you to read. It's on his website. So I'm really delighted again to have Larry, and now Larry will take on introduce the panel.
So thank you, Raj, and I'm really happy that the group we've started recently this year, the Resilient Cities Housing Initiative, is able to co-sponsor this, and really it ends a week where we've finally been beginning to get our groups sitting down to one another, often brokered by third parties, so and excuses. So this is, I think, an opportunity to do that. We have an excellent set of people to try and talk through the relationship among a lot of key words. So gentrification, displacement, Boston, challenges, and strategies, right? So any two of those would be a challenge or a strategy. And to put all of that together is not so easy. So before we turn to the panel, I thought it might be worth talking about at least a couple of those key terms, gentrification and displacement. And as Raj said, they're not always put together, and they're not always analyzed very systematically, and they're not always talked about in terms of Boston. We're in the 50th year anniversary of the coining of the term gentrification by Ruth Glass in 1964, and that's been followed by a huge outpouring of literature in economic geography and in many other fields that have either emphasized the kind of economic explanations, the kind of production side, or more cultural kinds of considerations that one might call the consumption side. And you get a very contentious literature that is particularly well summed up in a reader by Loretta Lees, Tom Slater, and Alvin Wiley called, of all things, the Gentrification Reader. And any of you who are seeking a one-stop shop into what's been written and said about these debates, I commend that one to you. The same three authors actually authored a book called Gentrification that is attempting to make sense of that literature. So you can kind of do it in a digested way by them, or you can actually see the original pieces organized into several hundred pages. And I think they've done a really good job of trying to deal with the contentious literature of it. And at one point, Tom Slater takes, I think, the simplest definition of gentrification, one that he gets from Jason Hackworth, as the production of space for progressively more affluent users. And so it gets the class transformation and the fact that it's spatially produced, and that's really important. And what that means, though, is that the displacement can either be quite direct, the kinds of things that really happen through eviction and the incapacity of low-income households to afford a dramatic increase in their housing costs. But it also could be a kind of indirect process. The gradual elimination of just having a pool of low-rent housing in these kinds of neighborhoods. This is what the housing scholar and lawyer Peter Marcuse has called exclusionary displacement, which I think is a pretty good term. So you get lots of people talking about displacement very actively and writing about it all through the 1970s and 80s. And then, for some reason, it seems to have slipped out of the discussion for a number of years, in the 90s in particular, in part because displacement was seen as not a very easy thing to measure, but I think even more importantly because it lost much of its critical edge in an expanding world of neoliberal policies. So it gets euphemized and lost and buried under terms like regeneration, as producing necessary reinvestment in places, and then people are not always thinking about it. There was an essay, now somewhat infamous, I think, by the architect, the new urbanist Andres Duane, who spoke in our own department not all that long ago, an essay called 3 Cheers for Gentrification, in which he said as follows: gentrification rebalances a concentration of poverty by providing the tax base, rub-off work ethic, and political effectiveness of a middle class, and in the process improves the quality of life for all a community's residents. It is the rising tide that lifts all boats. So this is what people who want to see gentrification as a little more nefarious than that are up against. The problem, of course, is really twofold. Many people don't have boats to live, and many of them have been displaced from the harbor by the incoming tide of investment. And so there are a lot of problems. And then things got even more complicated because the research side of displacement had another upsurge after 2004, when there was a study about New York by Lance Freeman and Frank Bocconi that looked at this, the data set from the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey from the 1990s. And it really reignited debate because what they found was that low-income and less educated households that were living in gentrifying neighborhoods were actually 19% less likely to move than those in other neighborhoods that they studied, so that displacement was not limited. So this was actually an article in a scholarly journal and that was fairly even-handed, but the headline that emerges in places like USA Today and various others basically said, you don't need to worry about it. What they were saying was, in the article, was that a lot of low-income households were choosing to stay in their neighborhoods rather than move because they liked having the improved services that came with having more affluent neighbors, and they simply had to pay a little more of their income for rent. And so it was seen and caricatured as problem solved in New York, that it's not so terrible kinds of things to do. But of course what would happen is if you didn't think that displacement was a problem, and then there's no downside to any of the market-oriented privatization approaches, and urban regeneration is exactly what we want, and there's no reason to worry about it. So then this, of course, launches a kind of rebuttal in the literature that is epitomized by a very well-done article by Kathy Newman and Elvin Wiley that was published under the title "The Right to Stay Put Revisited: Gentrification and Resistance to Displacement in New York City." And they reanalyzed the data from Freeman and Bocconi and added an additional layer of qualitative research. And then Freeman wrote his own book that was a little more subtle, called "There Goes the Hood," and they all looked at this in a slightly different way. So part of what what Newman and Wiley were saying is that the people who are criticizing or minimizing the problems with displacement are just looking at the wrong neighborhoods. They were looking at neighborhoods that had already, in New York, that had already undergone generations of displacement and gentrification, and that the people who were still there were the ones who figured out pretty good ways of coping with it. They were comparing the gentrification that showed 19% more to only the worst case neighborhoods that were the worst off, and so it wasn't a good comparison. And then how did they define displaced? They wanted to actually look at how these people doing the research were trying to count it. Did they move because they wanted a less expensive residence and couldn't pay the rent, or did they move because the landlord was harassing them, or did they get displaced by private action like a condo conversion or something like that? So they might have both overestimated displacement if they were counting voluntary moves in search of a cheaper accommodation, but they were underestimating it because they didn't, in this study that got so much press, they ignored the people who left New York City, they ignored the people who fell into homelessness, and they ignored the people who doubled up with friends. In other words, they didn't count most of the things that actually happen when people get displaced. They also didn't include those who were evicted. Okay? So this is the literature and the academic world trying to make sense of it and having to work with what the data set tells you can count. So you had to do all of these kinds of things. So they missed the most logical kind of sources of this sort of thing. And so this is the kind of challenge that we face. Gentrification can be disguised as the desirability of social mix, to deflect the criticism. So people will say, oh, we need to have mixed income housing, but they don't always say that means mixing out the poor from the house. And so I don't know whether there is comparable academic research looking specifically at data on Boston to match the debates that have occurred over New York, and maybe our panelists will know, but whether or not there is actual academic research for all of its faults and some of its benefits. What we have tonight are a group of people who are really well placed to judge the situation on the ground and well placed to see how the gentrification and displacement nexus has been evolving in Boston. And so that's really helpful. In the middle of the 20th century, it was a different challenge in Boston. The concern was the big fiscal problem of the suburbanizing middle class, a loss of the people that were described as quality shoppers, right? So this is what the urban renewal era promised, the return of that kind of people. We don't need the old West End, we need the new West End, full of better off quality shoppers. We need new in-town living opportunities in places like the Prudential Center. But then, starting in the 70s, and we'll hear a lot of that, local communities began to experience the downside of large-scale renewal, especially due to the massive neighborhood disruptions of things like highway construction and a variety of tenant movements are really gaining ground. Some of our panelists have both chronicled and participated in these kinds of things. And various neighborhood organizations are really coming together to fight what Chester Hartman famously called the right to stay put, to fight for that. And gradually, the movement to retain and find and keep affordable housing has become a regional level challenge too. And so a group like the Metropolitan Area Planning Council is a really important part of it as well. So we've got people here to talk about all of these dimensions, and I'd like to introduce them in the order that they'll speak. So first, Carolyn Crockett, second from your right, is someone who's been with us for the year at MIT as the MLK visiting scholar, working with me and with Amos Byrne and with Vish Sanyal and various projects, some of them stemming from her plan to publish a book from her dissertation in American Studies at Yale that she finished last year, investigating large-scale land use changes in the U.S. and how these are related into social movements and political organizations among grassroots actors, particularly around the anti-highway movement that occurred here in Boston. So she's really prepared to get us from a key era in the direction of the present. Then we have Michael Kane right in the middle, and Michael has been an organizer and activist in Boston since 1972. He's been involved in fighting gentrification in the South End in the 1970s, and was involved in the 13-year struggle to create the tech city development. And then in 1980, he co-founded the Boston Affordable Housing Coalition in 1983, which is now known as the Mass Alliance of HUD Tenants, that has preserved 11,400 at-risk apartments through tenant organizing, including 1,377 and 8 resident-owned developments in Boston. And then since 1992, as if figuring out Massachusetts wasn't enough, he served as the executive director of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, the only national tenants union in the U.S., and has been winning funds to save housing and empower tenants. Then we have Steve Meacham, who's been an organizer also for over 40 years. You guys can figure out who got started first. Working particularly in the areas of housing, labor, and anti-war movements. I'm not sure whether the 9 years as a welder got you prepared for certain kinds of ways to get people moving. But 9 years at the Quincy Shipyard, and then since 1999, he's worked at City Life Vida Urbana, helping to develop their radical methods for community organizing. Karen Chen is arrived. Yes, great. Is the organizing director with the Chinese Progressive Association, a grassroots community-based organization working for full equality and empowerment of the Chinese community in Greater Boston and beyond. So we're moving a little more regional here. It's not all Boston all the time. She has been the organizing director and is currently prioritizing the Chinatown Stabilization Campaign. And then finally, Jennifer Wright is the Assistant Director of Land Use Planning and the Chief Housing Planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MATC, as we know it here. She's been there since 2007 and providing direct housing and planning technical assistance to municipalities while engaging in regional and statewide housing policy initiatives. So we're really happy to have such a group of people that have really been understanding this and living this for the last 40 plus years, and doing so not only in the center of the city, but also moving out into the region, since these are both city and regional places. So we've asked each person to limit comments to no more than 10 minutes, and that should give us at least 30 minutes or more at the end to engage among ourselves and also with the rest of you in the kinds of comments and questions that come up. So first, Carolyn, to talk with us about the sort of historical and contemporary dimensions of gentrification caused displacement. So Carolyn.
Thanks, Larry. Delighted to be here. Really happy to be on such a distinguished panel, and very much looking forward to our conversation at the end. So I'll try to leave my comments as brief. I have a few comments to make and some questions in there, so bear with me because I'm trying to tease this out as myself, so I hope the discussion will open that up. So the genesis is basically a lot of what we see today in terms of what Boston is was set in motion 50 years ago. We know that. So a lot of large-scale clearance and displacement has set the agenda for much of the organizing and the grassroots mobilizations that endure today. And I try to wind back to make sure we keep our thumb on a sense of industrial and economic change, and really keeping in mind the fact that we are also in the heart of the landscape that was the staging ground for the Industrial Revolution, right? And so actually we're talking about the birth of factory-based industrial capitalism in this moment of thinking about what does it mean to house workers, where do people live, what does that mean in terms of labor, in terms of wages, in terms of economic fight that is really inside of conversations about housing, about who should live where. And so thinking about so many battles that were really wedded with this conversation about industrial manufacturing and capitalist production that are really making us think more about, again, where are we now with this discussion? And so there's a scale of a type of urban poverty that gets produced in the 19th century that will continue to bedevil 20th century reformers. So in having a conversation about housing, I think it's really important for us to lift up a deeper conversation about the economy and also the creation of poverty. So what does it mean that our economy actually produces poverty in a real way? That poverty, the way it looks, the way we understand it, changes significantly over time. And how do we kind of keep our finger on what that actually means? And so all of these conversations about, again, housing, about poverty, about labor, about wages, worker conditions, really rooted in an earlier history in Massachusetts and continues a progressive union and organizing tradition that I think folks here will speak to. And so let's kind of go back and think about this mid-century moment in Boston. So mid-20th century, what's happening here? So we have a lot of folks that are starting to leave the city. So, right, I have so in 1950, the population had like 800,000 people, more than, significantly larger group of folks living here than today. So today, our population is around 630,000 people. So what was happening? How do we lose all these people and what happened in the middle? So in 1950, the city is kind of freaking out because people are here, but they're starting to leave after the post-war period. Larry talked about civilization, talked about the fact that the city's worried about its tax base. How do we think about getting people to stay here, or these new ideal shoppers, right? So urban renewal becomes launched here. I've got many cities across the country. The idea is to come up with a plan where we get federal money, 30% funding from the federal government to do clearance, to maybe do revitalization, new buildings. A lot of it actually was not for housing. So there was a lot of clearance that happened here. There were some new structures, a lot of high-rise structures that were for high-income residents. And this becomes an issue. So the moment in the city, we're actually needing to have new housing for folks that are living in substandard structure, but what was produced, what was actually created in the midst of that was not dealing with the need. Martin Anderson writes that the urban renewal program resulted in the displacement of about 1 million people across the country. So if you empty out the city of Boston 2 times, it's about 1 million people. So can you imagine that kind of level of displacement? And so my question is, what happened to those people? Not just where do they go once they're displaced because of urban renewal or because of highway expansion, as I'll talk about, but what happens to what they think about the government, what they think about what they're entitled to and where they should live, and how is that basically planting a political set of seats that will do who knows what in a decade or 2. So that's a real question for us. So once we get into this movement of trying to think about how does the city look, who should live here, what does the new Boston mean, and we get involved in all this clearance. So we talk about the West End clearance, a couple thousand families completely cleared out. And then we have a new mayor. Mayor Collins comes, brings Ed Lowe from New Haven and says, this new kind of planning is terrible. We cannot just clear out entire neighborhoods. We cannot just displace them. We need to plan with the people. So a new kind of moment to say, Ed Lowe wants to get in conversation with residents. Contentious battles there for sure, but the beginning of the idea of a new kind of a conversation that would lay the ground for lots of other organizing in the neighborhoods, as people in the neighborhoods are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the level of communication with the city, they like plan what they produce and then they do not represent their interests. And so as more residents are experiencing dispossession and dislocation in the city and intense vulnerability politically speaking, the city government itself is centralizing its own power. So the Boston Redevelopment Authority would emerge in Boston in 1957 and emerge as this incredibly unprecedented agency that has basically taken zoning, that's taking planning, and taking development and putting it into one agency. So an incredibly vulnerable and concerned populace faced with a really powerful and centralizing government authority. And so the effect of this is that people are really, again, raising up questions about how to make decisions, how to feel invested in where they live. And when we think about the West End and we read her jobs, we know that Mark Freed has written about the fact that people experience a deep sense of loss and a sense of grief because they were losing their homes, they were losing their sense of place, right? And I would move even farther than that and so there was a politicizing effect that all of these displacement battles were invited. So not only were people feeling the need to free because they were moved out of the West End, displaced and moved out of New York streets, moved out of sections of the South End and Roxbury, but they're also building this political consciousness about how would we respond? What would we do next? And so in that, you get the rise of the power of no, right? Not just to say no, but to turn that into a very particular type of politics. So from Tech City, residents saying, no, we don't want this housing to be, we don't want our existing housing to be lost for a parking lot. We want new development in 68 to be a Victoria's fight, to Town Village fighting. All of our housing developments across the city where residents have said, we have another plan. We do not believe that the city government is going to represent our interests and is capable of producing plans that we appreciate or that will actually, again, address the need for housing. And so then the question becomes about who exactly is in the driving seat. They're thinking about what the new Boston looks like. So it's not the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and it's not the mayor, and it's not a load, and it's not all these external agencies and organizations. How do communities on the ground in these neighborhoods start to build political power, start to build new kinds of organizations and new kinds of vehicles to bring to bear their plans, right? And so that on the heels of this, at the exact same time, you have incredible expansion in the federal interstate highway plan. So the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 released all of this federal dollars on the table so that communities can, so that cities can say, well, we need money. We need money to invest in our new cities. We need money to invest in realigning our transportation systems, and this is the way to go forward. So again, with the creation of, actually the extension of the Mass Pike, also the Central Artery, these are things that would make, again, new kind of physical inroads into the city, but also raise up all these political questions from residents that are saying, this is another way that we're going to be displaced. So Chinatown experienced displacement along Hudson Street with the extension of the Mass Pike, also the Mass Pike coming through Brighton. All these things would produce incredibly powerful memories, incredibly powerful moments for communities to resist, to articulate a new kind of politics, to say no, and to say we actually will come with a better plan. So it seems to me that a lot of these moments where the city has rolled out an urban renewal plan or has laid out a highway plan have been effectively resisted in many cases by residents, turns into what makes Boston such a livable place today. So if these plans had been successful, I believe that we would now be stuck in a city that is uninhabitable, that is surrounded by highways, that is cleared out, that is surrounded by even more economic polarity, and that would really make us feel like this is not a place again that we want to live. So the walkability of the city, the ease of it, the sense of place, the sense of history, even the sense of diversity, all of that would be made possible not because of what the feds or the city had in mind, but despite that. And so how can we have a conversation about what the visioning that residents were able to do and their organizing, how that was able to actually produce a city that we celebrate as this incredible 21st century place of so many cities around the country, around the world model themselves after. So I guess the point I would leave and I'll end here with is just the need to really think about what was the thinking and what was the conversation that residents and activists were engaged in this period, and how that again raises up a bigger conversation about how we think about poverty, how it's created, and all of the many tools that residents try to marshal to create a bigger consideration of city making aside from just housing, aside from just thinking about a narrow blueprint that has to do with placemaking and the material development of the city, but had to think about who could live here and how they would actually have access to a city for years. So I will stop.
So we turn next to Mike.
Okay, thank you. Actually, this is a great introduction to the history of the struggles against displacement and gentrification. Thank Carolyn for that. Carolyn mentioned the direct displacement of highway and urban renewal planning in the city in the 60s, and which was although Ed Loeb, I think, modified it, he was still implementing it. And there was resistance against the highway movement, the highway construction program by the Greater Gloucester Coalition on Transportation Crisis. A lot was led by Fred Salvucci, who was involved with that, so he came back, Chuck Turner, other community leaders. And in the South End, which was the epicenter for gentrification and displacement for many years in Boston, Mel King and others occupied what was now the 10 City site, which was a parking lot torn down by a former fire commissioner who made way for parking business right near the Prudential Center, which was built around that period. So the resistance there was called, the community coalition came together against the revised urban renewal plan that Loeb had agreed to because it was starting to displace predominantly people of color. The people involved in the planning were mostly white, ethnic, working class people. The minority community was largely excluded, so they formed a coalition called Cause, occupied the 10 City site, occupied the DRAN site office. There was a series of militant actions that led the mayor then, Kevin White, to respond with an elected urban renewal committee, which had some actual power over development and designation rights of development. So that struggle blocked a very bad plan for market rate housing in 1974, and the community formed the 10 City Task Force around that time to come up with an alternative plan. And it was a 13-year campaign to prevent a high-rise luxury apartment complex and or a parking garage for the air rights development that came up in 1978. And the Copley Place development was the first time that an air rights proposal had been made in the city. There was one that the mayor is talking about today, called the Fenway Center, which is very similar in concept. But it was the Copley Place development that really drew attention to indirect displacement, not the direct displacement so much of urban renewal highways, but the indirect displacement of a major investment project, high-rise hotels, luxury housing, and commercial complex anchored by Neiman Marcus, with a completely insulated environment where the public was excluded by walkways and inner courtyards and so on. A very different vision of the city than the inclusionary one that people in the South End wanted. So there was a struggle against Copley Place that began in 1978, and the demand from the community was to build 10 City on the nearby site. The Copley Place developers instead purchased the land, proposed an 8-story parking garage and luxury housing. And that became a very intense struggle for several years. I won't go into the whole story, but the upshot of it was the community coalition that came together was a citywide coalition as well as one led by CPAC in the South End. And it was a broad coalition of tenants and homeowners, including middle-class homeowners who were liberals and who supported an inclusive neighborhood. It's not if you envision the struggle around gentrification as a 10-year struggle, we think that's a mistake. We had to form a multi-class, a class alliance. It was really a class struggle, but there was a portion of the middle class that could be counted on as allies, the ones who were not there to just profit on the turnover of their units. So the middle class was somewhat split politically, and a key strategic thing was to bring off the sector of the middle class and alliance with working class groups. The tactics that were used were broad. Demonstrations, press conferences, lawsuits, building occupation in 1982, a variety of things which over a period of years created a sort of ideological hegemony that what was going to happen there was only going to be what the community wanted and not what the developers wanted. There was a struggle inside of 10 City Corporation, a nonprofit that was set up over that. It's important to recognize that even within nonprofit organizations, there's often a class struggle over the vision and direction with people who maybe are thinking more about their careers, willing to make compromises, or with what good intentions, wanting to get something or if anything done, and others who want to to achieve the community's vision of affordable housing and empowerment on another faction. So there was a struggle inside the city corporation, and the faction that wanted a tent city vision of inclusive housing, affordable housing, prevailed. We prevailed because there was a shift in power at the city level. In the last 8 years of Kevin White, from 1975, there was a radical change. White had previously supported rent control. After 1975, he opposed it. And that was at the citywide level, that was part of the problem. In the last 8 years of his administration, he opposed any new low-income housing for families, not just in the South End, but in the Back Bay, in the back of the Hill area, which is built in the Plain. So by 1983, there was his administration was very much oriented to downtown development. There was a reaction in the election of '83 with Ray Flynn and Al King for the two finalists. Flynn implemented a different program when he won, which favored, he supported rent control, although there wasn't enough support in the council to restore it. There were impositions on condo controls, other kinds of regulations on the market rent grievance system, and there was support the first time for nonprofit housing. That's what made Tent City possible. His administration could be brought by the community coalition to support our demands. We had to keep pushing because it took a struggle even then. But there was a shift in the overall city's policy regarding that. I should mention that during the Kevin White period, we saw the gentrification and displacement problem in broader terms and realized it was a citywide phenomenon. So the groups at the time formed an anti-displacement platform, which was picked up in Chester Hartman's book, Displacement, How to Fight It, and I looked at it recently, and it holds up remarkably well. It's essentially a right to the city platform. It includes regulations on the market, a speculation tax, expansion of the social housing sector, affordable housing or resident-controlled housing, and a systematic basis, racially inclusive housing and anti-discrimination program, and so on, a safe and open city. So there's a very comprehensive platform there that is still useful. But it wasn't possible to get very far with that until the political system had shifted, and there was some era that was more open to those things, and there was a community coalition pushing them to the left. So that worked for about 8 years, and that the other thing I should mention is that during that period, the DRA took a much more progressive line in relation to downtown development. So for about 8 years was a better approach on that. We could get the DRA to do things for affordable housing. Under Menino, the political consensus shifted. There was less support for regulation. When rent control was repealed by the voters in '94, there was no support from the Menino administration in the referendum fight. We lost. And ever since then, essentially with the demise of rent control, rents have tripled in the area without anywhere near that level of investment. And that's been a major problem that leads to the problem, to the spread of displacement and gentrification citywide, a lack of regulation. Menino did continue the policy of supporting nonprofit developers, so that has continued. But the emphasis on downtown mega projects and development has gone on steroids. And now the problem of indirect displacement that we were fighting with Copley Place is spread to Charlestown in the North End and Chinatown in the 90s. Now it's spreading to South Boston, Brighton, and really pockets of every neighborhood where high-rise or market-only development is being built. And right now, there's 8,000 units of market-rate luxury housing that are under construction or in the pipeline. Without regulation on the markets, that kind of development will act as a price leader and force up the rents nearby. It's indirect displacement. There's a building in the South End where there's a $10,000 a month apartment next to the city. Next door to the city, $10,000 a month. And new development is going up in the $4,000 to $6,000 a month range in the Ink Block in the South End, which used to be New York streets, etc. So our struggle, that same kind of class struggle where we need to include working class homeowners and any middle class homeowners who support a diverse community, along with tenants of all kinds, has to be deepened, and we have to have a powerful enough political movement to win back rent control, condo controls, real estate speculation. Yes.
Thank you. I can't resist starting by saying that I started my lifelong devotion to community organizing in 1972 by dropping out of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning and organizing to fight MIT expansion. So the whole displacement.mit.edu has a different connotation. But two things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to give kind of a snapshot of current levels of resistance. And there is a remarkable level of resistance going on right now. They didn't get the memo of that one book that Displacement is not to be concerned about. But before I do that, just two quick statistics. One is that in 2008, there were 1,200 foreclosures in Boston. And on average, that was 2 units per foreclosure. So that's about 2,400 units, 5,000 people, something like that. That number of people were faced with no-fault eviction by banks in 1 year in the city of Boston. So it is not as dramatic as a tsunami, but it's 5,000 people being evicted no-fault in 1 year just by the banks in 2008. And no-fault eviction in Massachusetts is illegal. No-fault eviction is a prime weapon in gentrification, and it's legal. But not all of them got displaced because several hundred reached us. But most of the people who didn't reach us did get displaced. Now, in tenant organizing, faced with current rise in rents, we have a median renter income in the city of Boston that's maybe in the mid-30s, meaning that they can afford, by HUD standards, a rent plus utility payment of about $900 a month. And for a two-bedroom. The listed apartments are probably more like $1,600, $1,700. Or even higher. So there is the housing crisis in a nutshell. And those people are being forced out by those rents. And that problem, although I don't have the statistics, is also equally as massive as what was being faced by the banks. So it's a huge level of, a huge problem. Now, in response to that, people organized. But I think it was stated well in the beginning that one of the key problems in how to organize is general acceptance of the market, of market orthodoxy, and of neoliberalism. But nevertheless, a remarkable number of people do resist, and I want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, around the foreclosure campaign, we've been fighting foreclosure and bank eviction for the last 6 or 7 years. And during that time, we have 3 sites that are working against foreclosure that we run. One in Brockton, one in Boston, and one in Northside, we call it, East Boston, Revere, Malden, and Everett. And about 150 people come to those 3 sites every week, more or less, seeking help and seeking to organize. And they organize about an action every week. So some kind of vigil, some kind of protest in front of the bank, some kind of protest in front of a government building, on the pace of about 1 per week over the last several years. 40 of those actions have been eviction blockades, where people gather in front of a house, link arms, and are willing to risk arrest to try to stop somebody from being evicted. 38 of those 40 were to defend former homeowners, actually, not even tenants, who have emerged as some of the fiercest tenant activists, people who are totally committed to their place and are refusing to move. We have won most of those eviction blockades, and we have won most of those battles that we fought. We've shown that it's possible to stop the banks from, for instance, from evicting people. But to come and fight means that you have to accept, as one of my colleagues once said in the beginning of all of our meetings, he says, we're not normal here at City Hall. And the way that she meant that we're not normal is that we don't accept the market. We don't accept that the market is any kind of an arbiter for a fair rent or what should happen to people faced with bank foreclosures, or any kind of an arbiter for why people who got caught in the housing bubble shouldn't get a principal reduction down to real value. And because we're not normal, we're able to provide a context for how people can organize. Similarly, in tenant organizing, we don't accept that the market determines the fair wage. And so people can come into our space and have the moral space to organize the fight against displacement. Out of all of that effort to fight bank foreclosures and evictions, I wanted to give a couple of examples of just real people. The St. Simone family was being evicted in Hyde Park, and we did 4 eviction blockades to them. 4 times we got in front of the building and linked arms and risked arrest in order to fend off the bank. The first 3 times succeeded, the 4th he was evicted. In the case of Francis Lewis living in Mattapan, similarly we did 4 eviction blockades, and it was only in the 4th one that they got us. Both of those families turned around and then occupied, with our support, this was before they occupied them, occupied vacant foreclosed buildings, took them over, and they're still there. So we're talking about pretty high level of dedicated radical resistance to give those 2 families, to use the example of those 2 families. Aloysius Nolenko just came to our meeting last week and announced that we did an eviction blockade for him a year ago against Bank of America. One, an interim investor bought the building, was just selling it back to him. He owed $400,000 on his mortgage, and he's getting it back for about $180,000. So there have been hundreds of examples of that, of people fighting the bank through foreclosure, and even after foreclosure, and even after eviction judgment. So that's a remarkable level of resistance, even though it doesn't rise to what we need. Now, in the tenant organizing arena, we have tried to pioneer a method that is very much like what labor unions do, collective bargaining. So buildings will get a big increase in rent, and people will say, we can't pay this increase, we refuse to pay it, we're going to continue to pay the old rent, we're going to face no-fault eviction by paying the old rent, and we're going to organize to fight the rent increase. Most of the people who organize to fight rent increases in this manner win. A landlord can increase the rent as much as they want, as often as they want in Massachusetts, outside of the lease or outside of some kind of rent restrictions like HUD buildings. But a landlord can evict no fault in Massachusetts. But nevertheless, when people get big rent increases or they're faced with no fault evictions and they organize and they demand collective bargaining, they generally win. They win something that allows them to stay. At 760 Cummins Highway in Mattapan, which happens to be right next to a future stop on the Fairmont line, I might want to just say that the Fairmont line is an example of an effort to get new stops on a commuter rail to fight against something that everybody described as transit racism, because the red line was kind of to the east of communities of color, the orange line was to the west of communities of color, the Fairmont line ran right through the communities of color, but you couldn't get on it. So all the neighborhood associations fought for new stops, but now that we're winning the new stops, everybody is recognizing that these new stops are going to drive everybody out who fought for them. So in the area of displacement and gentrification, this hollow understanding that we all share that people who do the work should get the reward doesn't work. In fact, the people who do the work, people who invest their time in improving their neighborhood, the people who invest their tax dollars, and if you're a tenant, you pay real estate taxes, the people who make that investment get driven out by the very success of their investment. So we're trying to organize all over the city of Boston and north and south of Boston using this understanding to say, come into our space with the Chinese Progressive Association and Mass Alliance Left Tenants, and leave all your shame at the door and come into the space, support each other, and fight this monstrosity, and that it can be done. In 760 Cummins Highway, where we just had a rally on March 22nd, they fought off one landlord for years and years and managed to stay there. And now they're trying to fight off another. And these people have been there 30, 35, and 40 years in one place, in one building. City Realty, which has bought 500 units of foreclosed buildings in the last few years, are regularly evicting and raising rents on everybody in the buildings they buy. Former homeowners, they buy the house out from under them when they're trying to get it back. One case, Ray Fernandez, he offered to buy his house back for $230,000. City Realty bought for $233,000. Turned around and said they sell it back to him for $490,000. when asked in a deposition, what value did you add to that real estate that would allow you to increase the price that much, the owner of City Building said, nothing. So, but we're going to need a level of resistance to rent increases and no-fault evictions. Even though this level of fighting back is pretty significant, we're going to need a level that's 10 times this if we want to get rent control back or any kind of real policy protections. We're going to need a huge level of resistance because the real estate industry is extremely powerful. And I think what Freedom Recluse said, the housing crisis doesn't exist because the system doesn't work. The housing crisis exists because that's the way the system works. And given that fact, and given the role of the real estate industry, we need to increase the level of resistance and spread this model, and that will get us different policy. Thanks.
So we're moving on to Karen Chen. Do you have images or no?
No.
Okay.
So, thank you for having me. Although the Chinese Progressive Association, we have like members all over in the Greater Boston area, but actually our, community stabilization and tenant organizing was really mostly focused in Chinatown because, Chinatown played a critical role in the Chinese community. We have about, 150 years of history, and Chinatown was formed because of racism and discrimination. And so I think that, also over the years, I think Chinatown's role in the community is particularly important to new immigrants because of the services that, Chinatown has to provide. And, if you look at, Chinatown physically, right, Chinatown has a lot of imaginary borders. There's two major highways that go through, Chinatown, is like the 93 and, the expressway, right? And then also this, Mass Pike, right? It's right by Chinatown. And then there's also two major institutions within Chinatown, New England Medical Center, now it's Tufts Medical Center, and then the Tufts Medical School. So actually, it's like, it feels like we've been, fighting the survival of Chinatown, forever, because and then urban renewal came around, a lot of row houses were knocked down, actually one of the buildings, because we had to build the surface artery, they actually chopped one of the buildings in half, to make way for the highway, right? And so that's a lot of it, is in the, 50s and 60s. And then, most recently, what's happening in Chinatown is that, starting about, 2000, it's this kickoff of all these luxury towers on Washington Street. If you walk down Washington Street now, you see a lot of high rises, compared to, before it's like, a lot of, low rises, right? And, when they built these luxury housing and, everybody was like, no, Chinatown's going to be fine because you have these, big, subsidized housing. They have like Tycoon Village, Mass Pike Towers and Castle Square, and these are some of the big, subsidized housing complex, right? But the thing is that, is that enough housing, for Chinatown? Because, people forget that, actually, if you walk around Chinatown, if you look above the business, there's actually a lot of people living upstairs. And then also the row houses too, that also provide, a lot of, affordable housing to, the working class families. But a lot of people don't recognize that, and also, even within some of these subsidized housing, and they're also housing that are like, that are not Section 8, so they're like moderate income housing. And actually, a lot of those housing actually holds a lot of families who are actually low income but waiting for stable housing, but that's cheaper than what's in the market, and in probably better condition than some of the privately owned, row houses, right? So, so as soon as they build these towers, and actually CPA had a, community referendum to fight on Liberty Place, and now it's Archstone, it's right next to the RMB. And, at that time, actually, within the Chinese community, some people actually supported that because, there was a sector in the community believes that with development it brings, business, and other economic opportunities. But I think the question is for whom, right? And so actually there's, struggles within the community, but it's also outside as well. So we had a community referendum where, people voted on, do you
support this development as a 28-story luxury tower. And then also do you support, to rezone the combat zone because, combat zone is in Chinatown. It moved to Chinatown in the 70s because the business sector supported it because they think that it will bring business and forgot about all the other things that will bring. And so, and then when they built these, luxury towers along Washington Street with combat zone, they say, you know what? This is how we're going to get rid of the combat zone. And so that's why, everyone should support the development of these luxury towers. And then, and then the third question was, do you support, residents' control over development? So the community voted overwhelmingly opposed the development of Liberty Place, 70%. But there's a lot of lobbying from the business sector saying to get the residents to vote for it. And, almost everyone supported to rezone the combat zone because we say, you know what? If you don't want to have combat zone in Chinatown, let's rezone it. If the city has to have adult entertainment, let's spread the responsibility, right? I don't know, right? And then and then everyone supported, residents' control of development. So that led to forming, a residents-only entity, the Chinatown Residents Association. But we were not successful in stopping Liberty Place. They built it, and then they continued to build, one after another, right, luxury towers. So starting from 2000, there's about 3,225 luxury units, that's built or approved. And then in contrast, there's about 422 moderate income housing, and then the real low income housing that's really affordable to the community is 134. So that's a lot of luxury housing versus, very few affordable housing. So after Liberty Place, was built, what's happening to the community is that, we saw 5 to 6 buildings in Chinatown facing double-digit rent increases. And a lot of them are subsidized housing. They're like Section 236, a lot of the moderate type income housing. And we were able to slow down some of the increases, through organizing the tenants. Instead of having, a 15%, 1 year, maybe, drag it out to 3 to 5 years or something. And then also there's a few ownership turnovers that's happening. And that's, I think, the beginning of that we notice a drastic difference in how, kind of the housing in Chinatown. So we have, Essex Street, Hamilton Company bought like a 50-unit housing complex, and usually it's around like $700 to $900 a month. And then immediately, right after they bought it, the rent doubled. And what happened is a lot of people ended up moving out. And we were fighting to get 2 families to stay. And, they were able to keep their rent from not going up for 1 year for those 2 families. But eventually, they had to move out. And then also, like on Harrison Ave, there was one building that like people used to pay, a lot of elderly lives there because they can't, get into elderly housing, but it was affordable and convenient for them. They pay $600 a month, and then as soon as they sold, the building got sold, they said, guess what? The rent is going to be $2,500 a month. And and we were able to kind of like help them. We haven't been, unlike city life, we haven't been really, we haven't done, eviction blockades. And at that time, this is around 2005 or 2006. And so, some of the tenants, they were able to find, other places, right, to live. And then now, if you fast forward, to 2013, we actually have a lot of tenants who live in row houses. We're actually currently working with tenants in 10 different buildings and facing the risk of displacement. And what's happening is that, a lot of these row houses, and people are starting to fight eviction. And why is that people do that? It's because people have nowhere to go. If you look at, how many luxury housing units been built, and how many, 3,000 versus 134, right? And most of those are actually elderly housing, and mostly like 1 bedroom, and you could not house, a family. And that's why people actually, tenants and say, they feel like, we have to fight eviction because there's really nowhere to go. And then also this importance of, for them to, be made in Chinatown, because as you, look at the trend, the working class sector in Chinatown is starting to disappear. And, what's happening is what's left of the private housing, the rent continue to go up. Something that used to be $1,000 goes up to $2,000. But some people still stay in Chinatown. And how they manage to stay is by, crowding 3 families into 1 unit. So we actually have, a tenant that, this one building, and there's actually in 1 unit for 3 bedrooms, there's 3 families living there, total of 11 people. And the landlord is saying that I can't allow this to happen because if I get inspected, I am in violation. And then, so this is how people manage to, stay. And then now, and a lot of people are saying that nobody in a lot of these row houses, for many years, they haven't been fixed. And all of a sudden now, the landlord's saying, you know what, I'm going to fix up the place. And all of a sudden, when they fix up these places, rent would be, $1,000, a little over $1,000. It goes to $3,000 and $4,000. We actually have this tenant in Harrison Ave. We just, we went to court with them. There was a move-out agreement for 6 months. And as soon as there was a move-out agreement, the landlord went to the city and actually requested to add 2 units to the building. And then we have other people getting this, other tenants, know that they have like notice to quit, and go ask the landlord, say, well, you're renovating your place, would you rent it to us? He's like, sure. How much is the rent? Well, I'm going to rent them $3,000 to $4,000. And these tenants, this tenant at Harrison Ave, they're currently paying $1,400 a month. So this is, what's happening, and we feel like, it's really important for us to, stabilize Chinatown, and that there's, there needs to be policy that actually focus on really stabilizing working class families. And a lot of people are talking about mixed income, and that bringing back the middle class is a way to, stabilize the community. I think it's really important to actually lift up the working class so that they can become the middle class and to stabilize the community. Because actually the people, who've been there the longest have invested, like Steve said, invested the most in the community. But once the community looks nicer, a lot of people can say that, you walk around Chinatown, it was a lot more pleasant. But will there be, Chinese people living there is the question. And that, will the very people who built this community, will they still be there is a really, good question, So actually one of our community stabilization, goal, because it's on the thing, it's, try to start a community land trust, but there will be community control. Then really, take some of the, because we went through a lot of master planning process, and they identify these anchor sites, right? That way you can keep Chinatown forever. But we already lost a lot of opportunity in those anchor sites. And then, what really we feel like, we need to do is really take, some of the housing or some of the land out of the speculative market and have the community have control. And we're just starting to do that, and we're hopeful that, we can preserve some of Chinatown. So,
Finally, Jenny.
I'm going to stand. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me to talk about this issue. It's incredibly important to me. It's something that we've been thinking about at MAPC for at least the past 5 years that I've been there, in the time that I've been there. But wanted to kind of start with some of the kind of buzzwords that, and I've heard them even just in this discussion. I think, though, that I want to say first that I am likely coming from a very different angle in this conversation, where I'll be talking a lot more about policy, regulatory pieces, and the work that we've been doing at Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is, as Professor Bale mentioned, not just Boston, but also a lot of other communities in and around Boston. So I start with this slide, which is I think I'm okay. If you'd like me to move, I will. So high-rise luxury condos, luxury living, does it come back? Yeah. Downsizing seniors, young families, empty nesters, seeking urban amenities. These are the words we sometimes hear when community renewal is taking place, sometimes with little mention of creating housing that all people can afford. It happens in San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., and Greater Boston. All are facing constrained housing markets that have become unsustainable for most families to live. The photograph that I'm showing here is an image of the to-be-developed The Darcy, an 80-unit high-rise mixed-use development in Bethesda, Maryland. I realize that's not Boston. Located on a former surface parking lot. The connection to this discussion, though, is twofold. One is Bethesda is actually near my childhood home. And over the years that I've been going back there, I've seen how much the place has changed and who has lost and who has benefited from those changes. So it kind of brings some personal meaning to the discussion. And Montgomery County, on the other side of it, has actually a very clear housing plan and very clear housing policies in place to both advance housing equity and also things like smart growth, transit-oriented development, fair housing, and a lot of the same kinds of goals that we talk about here in Greater Boston. So when I went home over the past weekend and saw this, just one more hole in the ground being filled with more luxury housing in Bethesda, Montgomery County, Maryland, I thought to myself, wow, that just seems like another interesting kind of turn of events for that area. And it also made me think about the things that we're doing here at MAPC in the metropolitan region to serve families throughout the region. We come at it actually from a lot of different angles. I'm going to kind of go through a bunch of them. One is to establish regional housing production goals, sort of at the big picture level. So establishing clear housing production targets, not just for the broader region, but also for smaller pieces of the region. So we actually cover 101 communities in and around Boston and have 8 smaller subregions. And then we also have, for each municipality, very specific housing targets that we've created. So that basically tell them, create a tool to talk with them about the kind of housing that they need and the kind of housing growth that they should anticipate based upon their current population and population trends that we're seeing throughout the region. We've also been looking at transit-oriented development very carefully in the past few years in particular, and have then developed regional transit-oriented development goals as part of our regional plan. We've also propelled the development of 2 regional transit-oriented development funds, assessed the gap in financing for TOD, identified some site opportunities and constraints for new large-scale transformational types of development in Quincy, Beverly, Melrose, and Gloucester. We're working on policy-related elements to transit-oriented development funding and funding formulas that encourage this, and working on tools also for communities to manage what we call neighborhood change. So we don't necessarily say displacement or gentrification, we come at it by saying how to manage neighborhood change. And specifically in transit locations, but also in other locations where there's development pressures. We've done this through creating a lot of research that's all on our MAPC website, but also looking at specific areas where this sort of development, these development pressures are taking place in a couple of locations. So one of them is actually in Roxbury and Mattapan and Dorchester. We did a health impact assessment that included looking at gentrification and displacement issues, and then also looking at, slides not very good there. Looking at, I don't know why, but the color, yeah. Looking at displacement pressures in Somerville and also in Revere. We've been asked as part of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission to look at impacts of potential casinos. One is in Suffolk Downs, which would be technically Revere. And the other one would be the Wynn Casino, which would be in Everett. And we've been asked to, and have been looking at the potential casino impacts related to housing for Somerville as well as Revere, Winthrop, and some other communities in and around Boston. So as part of this, we've been working on these projects, and the plans that have come out of them included working with the neighborhood developers in the city of Revere on a community-led action plan for Shirley Avenue, which is basically a part of Revere Beach. And it includes housing actions to ultimately prevent displacement and look at housing stabilization issues. It's okay. It's okay. And then working with Somerville Community Corporation and the City of Somerville to look at what we term the dimensions of displacement. It's a study that we've been doing for the last 2 years, and it was meant to be used to guide basically how would they mitigate as well as track neighborhood change that would be happening as a result of the Green Line extension in Somerville. And that goal was, the goal of the study was to have that baseline data and projections, but also to be able to closely monitor those indicators of change. So we looked at things like housing tenure, household size and type, bedroom count, cost burden, mortgage status, overcrowding, geographic mobility, race and ethnicity, education, citizenship status, income and poverty status, and housing turnover. The study also helped to inform really key policies that would advance different community groups' housing goals, as well as the City of Somerville's Summer Vision, which is their comprehensive plan's goals. The city actually stated in that plan that they wish to increase their housing inventory by 6,000 units to 2030, which would include 1,200 permanently affordable units. And the policies that they've talked about include things like improving their inclusionary zoning ordinance, acquisition, rehab, and development programs, encouraging and requiring a lot more 3+ bedroom housing, a lot more family housing is needed in that particular community, providing targeted rental assistance in key station areas where there will be future station areas related to the Green Line, looking at a real estate transfer tax, tax abatements, tax increment financing, and then of course tracking those indicators of change that we've established through this report. They also, though, are talking about the importance of looking at middle-income housing, and a lot of communities in Metro Boston are talking about the importance of middle-income housing. Though we at MAPC recognize that there's a tremendous mismatch between the reality of the need for much more housing for lower-income families, not just middle-income households. So we sort of have this delicate balance of sharing the information about what we know is needed with the political atmosphere and the political climate when we're working on housing planning, local housing policy. So we work to encourage communities to create TOD and neighborhood redevelopment, but through inclusive planning and policies. That's not exactly easy. It sounds great to talk about it, but it is incredibly difficult. We start with housing planning. That's kind of the most fundamental element of what we do. Providing the data and the research is one component, but to create a housing plan means gaining agreement on the unmet housing needs and then setting those clear objectives, identifying local development constraints and figuring out a way to overcome them, and then identifying the priority development strategies that are needed at the local level and aligning strategies in order to move things forward. That's the part that's really hard, because then it's also lining up leadership, the local champions, and the resources that you need to actually do that affordable housing development and make it work. So I guess at the end of all of this, I have probably more questions than I have answers. At this point, we are really breaking into studying more and thinking about what it looks like in different communities. The way things look in Somerville versus Revere and versus Boston are all tremendously different, not to mention some of our much more suburban communities. So the questions that I continue to have include, how do we address that tremendous regional mismatch between need and available housing? What really is the role of social housing and nonprofit organizations in helping to address this issue, as we've heard from some of the previous panelists? What is the role of asset building programs to help people with their own independence and ability to create local capital? What are the appropriate regulatory tools in different places? Because I think they look different. I don't think there is one answer. Like bringing back rent control to me is not the only answer, or is not necessarily the right answer in every location. What also we are thinking about is not just residential, but commercial displacement. So I know that that has not come up exactly yet, but it is definitely something that we've thought about with Somerville and certainly in Revere as well. And then how do we really control the private market? That's kind of the big elephant in the room. What do you really do about the private landlord who owns the 3-family? There's no regulatory controls other than maybe they have a lease agreement or something else with the local tenants. But, you know, that's a big problem too. And then is it really possible to have development without displacement? We need more development, but can it really happen without displacement? You know, the Bay Area is really interested in this issue and is looking at those sorts of tools for development without displacement, but is it really possible? So those are my questions to you. I know we're going to all talk about it now, and so thank you for your time.
So can the panelists all come back up to the front here?
And I do have some reports.
Great. Okay, Robert. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for staying on time so that the promised 30 minutes of conversation is in fact a reality. We didn't displace our time. And we have a chance first to get to any of the panelists want to react to anything that they heard from one or the other, either to underscore something or to dispute something or to ask for clarification. Is there anything that any of you wanted to ask from what you've heard already?
There's when you go into housing court, the question was, what is a no-fault eviction? You go into housing court and you receive a summons. First you get a notice to quit that cancels your contract, then you receive a summons, and the summons will say, you didn't get out when we told you to. It won't list as a reason under the reason. And that's legal in Massachusetts, you don't need a reason. So you need a reason if you're going to evict during a lease, you need a reason if you're going to evict a Section 8 tenant, but most people don't have that.
So we've heard some examples of various tactics and strategies to guard against this, and we've also heard some conversations about policies and regulations and planning kinds of things. Sometimes it seems like these two worlds can work together. Sometimes there are different ways of approaching the same kinds of things from different kinds of mindsets and different kinds of action attitudes. But I'd love to hear from those of you who've been listening and how you like to engage our members.
Hi, I'm Tracy Corley. I'm actually transitioning to LPP Prolong Public Policy PhD program at Northeastern. We're talking a lot right now about strategizing around public policy, and I just thank the panelists for providing a very broad perspective of all the things that have happened historically and currently around this whole issue. I just recently finished looking at a number of different cities, about 220 different cities across North America that have been going through sustainable development, and there are challenges with gentrification and displacement. And one of the big key challenges has been the policy side. And so it's great that we have someone here who actually works with an institution from the city level, as well as the people here who actually are working along with the communities. So I have two questions. What recent policy innovations do you feel have promised, whether they've been enacted or not, to actually help address this issue? And then the second thing is how are communities actually strategizing to be prepared for when the opportunity presents itself to actually make policy innovations?
Anything was working. We started off with I know everybody had a half full glass. And almost everybody's got a half empty glass here, but I bet there's some ways of filling this back.
I think that's part of it. Actually, I don't think that it's not like there are new policy ideas. Most of the policy ideas have been out there for decades. It's not a mystery. The main thing is we need to figure out ways to regulate the market. If we don't do that, it's impossible to have without displacement. In fact, even with a strong rent control system, there will be displacement and gentrification, as we've seen in New York City, San Francisco, or Los Angeles. So it's a necessary but not sufficient set of, but there's a range of that. There's a range of ways to regulate rents. Another strategy has to be to take housing as much as possible out of the market to create social ownership in all of its forms, whether it's public housing, resident-controlled housing, limited equity co-ops, resident-controlled nonprofits. There's a variety of community land trusts. All of those models, there's 100 flowers blooming in that sector, and it can be radically expanded. That's what a lot of our organizing is about. We didn't mention one of the struggles right now is to protect the social sector, which is subsidized by the government through public housing and HUD multifamily housing and Section 8 vouchers, which is under attack in Washington by the right. There's a serious effort to dismantle those programs, and we've been fighting that locally and nationally for many years. It's gotten much more extreme in the last two or 3 years. We've had to form alliances with peace and labor groups because it's not enough to just fight to save housing subsidies. You have to form alliances with everybody else who's got a stake in the budget. But the other piece is we're working in the area called HUD multifamily housing, which is or sometimes called expiring use housing. The owners are for-profit owners. There's a fundamental contradiction between their interests and the public's interest when the buildings were built. And at different points in their history, the contracts end. Karen's been finding that in Chinatown, where the contracts end, and then what do you do? Because there's nothing that requires the owners to stay in the system. So that leads to a lot of tenant organizing campaigns, using collective bargaining strategies, forming tenant unions at the building level, and whenever possible, moving buildings out of the for-profit sector into the resident-owned sector. So that's what my organization has been, Mass Alliance of Tenants, has been focusing on that pretty exclusively for the last 30 years in Boston. The fight for rent control and other things, we've been part of those fights, but we've been, because of resource limitations, we've been really focused on that sector. It's still under attack, and we've won a lot. In the South End, we added it up the other day, we've actually preserved about 2,300 apartments, more or less permanently as affordable housing in that sector. Had we not done that, they would have been gone. Those would be $4,000 to $5,000 month apartments. So we've been able to move in on some of them are resident home buildings. So that's part of I know that's what the struggle in Chinatown is about that now. But it's really spreading to every neighborhood. So that's part of the answer. That's the first part of your question. Right, policy. Yeah, the policies are there. I mean, it's like on the shelf. Like the platform you did 30 years ago. So
well, for example, I'm just thinking about it was in Austin, Texas, and one of the things that they did in the Miller development is that all of the affordable housing has to be affordable housing for the life of the development.
It's permanent affordability has been a watch cry of the tenant movement for many years around here. And we've been able to negotiate 99-year lease contracts at places like Logan Apartments and South End Housing Co-op, and there's a number of buildings that will protect them more or less, subject to annual appropriation by Congress. So there's still that problem. We have to keep organized at a union level to make sure that the budget for housing is sustained. We proposed a line item in the city budget that was an innovation. In Boston, Walsh said that he would support that 3 days before the election if the federal government didn't provide enough funds. Government did come through with enough funds, but that crisis has just been postponed. It's going to come back. We need to keep that coalition together, and that demand for a city line item, 1% a year out of the city budget would fund, I think, it's like 3,000 vouchers in Boston. So we have the numbers now from the housing authority. We can put together a program from alliances to fight for that. But it's going to be a big fight because there's a lot of demands on the city budget.
So just a few things to build on what Michael was saying. One is absolutely stabilizing existing affordable housing units. I think that's one of the biggest things that has to happen, not just to stem the loss of units that we know with large numbers of units, but a lot of smaller units. There's a lot of sort of between 10 and 20 units here and there across Metro Boston that are at risk of being lost. They're not, reserved in perpetuity as affordable housing. So I think that's one of the biggest things. And just training municipal officials to monitor those units to ensure that people who are income eligible are living in them is a whole other component to that. So I think that's one piece. The other part is offering local incentives, either as a line item in the local budget, sort of a municipal appropriation, or through municipal affordable housing trust, which I do think is, I'm not sure that it's an innovation, but it's definitely a strong local tool because it provides that local voice for affordable housing in a lot of communities that really don't want to talk about the need for affordable housing more aggressively.
One of the really quick things, just an observation. I mean, you know, we've been all talking about bringing back some form of rent regulation, and that would be very controversial. But when the Cleveland Federal Reserve says that Boston is the city worst hit by gentrification in the country, then you would think that all things would be on the table, including, you think there'd be a big discussion about rent regulation. It might be controversial. A lot of people might oppose it, but it would be on the table. In that sense, it's kind of like single payer. I mean, you have a health crisis, and it's not like you're necessarily, you know, not like you have to leave single payer, but it should certainly be on the table. You know, so it's that kind of thing that the power of the industry keeps these things off the table.
So I just want to add that actually, you know, we're working together with City Life and, you know, other community organizations and thinking about forming this like neighborhood stabilization zone, which includes, you know, some community demands around, you know, increasing affordable housing resources. You know, that includes, you know, maybe increasing the formula for linkage, you know, and the inclusionary development, you know, requirements, because right now it's like 15%. And then, you know, and that's how, you know, where Chinatown is now is because it creates, you know, like Chinatown's tipping point is because of that. And I feel like that needs to be increased. And then also, at the same time, you know, like in other neighborhoods, they probably prefer payout, and the payout is not, you know, nearly enough. You know, I think right now the payout is like $200,000 per unit, but in fact, it costs $300,000 or more to build a unit. So like those policies need to change so that it's more affordable, you know, resources for affordable housing. And also, you know, in Boston, I know that, you know, the CDC, the community corporations, you know, they had talked about, you know, started a conversation about passing the Community Preservation Act, you know, in Boston, where you know, actually can, you know, the state can provide a match fund for, you know, it's like a tax, a 1% increase in property tax, and then that 1% would go to, you know, affordable housing, and then the state at the same time matches that. And then also another thing we think that could change, I'm not sure if it's like a policy thing, is that, you know, what we're finding is a lot of these mega developers, like, you know, Money and Partners, you know, they actually, you know, are not paying their fair share of, you know, the city cut all these deals that where they're shorting like millions, and while they're selling, you know, while they get like zoning relief, you know, for like 20 stories, and then like, you know, $20-something million tax break. At the same time, you know, that they don't meet their affordable housing fee requirements. I feel like, you know, the city should actually think about, you know, collecting some of these unpaid fees from these, you know, developers. You know, because, you know, they're, I mean, like the ink block, someone mentioned the ink block, right? And I think they're right now marketing their like 2-bedroom for $1.75 million per unit. And, you know, and then, but the thing is, like, you know, meanwhile, ink block is there, and we've been actually trying to get them to, you know, talk to us about, you know, having community, you know, access to jobs, because we're going to be a Whole Foods gym, and we want to be able to link, you know, have them, you know, some of their linkage money for training so people can go in there. But guess what? You know, all the money is gone, and we don't know where it went. And if you can actually think about development in a sense that they actually link to, you know, economic development in a more fair way. And also, like, you know, whenever they have these developments, right? And there's, you know, environmental impact and all kind of impact reports that people have to confuse. But what about socioeconomic impact in the community? You know, so I think some of those things that, you know, could be, you know, could help in actually stabilizing working class community.
Yeah, I wanted to put another strategy on the table and a couple of elephants in the room, specifically in Cambridge, specifically about MIT. I worked 50 years ago with Chester Hardman, Mike, and Bob Goodman, who was on the DUS faculty at MIT at the time, Tony Lee, Lucy Peedy, and others, to fight against the New Belt Highway with local neighborhood activists, particularly in the Central Square area. I was pleased and proud to be part of it. We actually won. Probably there were 1,500 dwelling units in the Central Square area. Probably another 1,000 dwelling units along the Route 2 extension that was proposed to run essentially through Porter Square and Union Square along the edge of Cambridge and Somerville. Fight worth fighting. Glad to have participated in it. Lots of nice people. We ended up shifting the money into transit, a better place for it to go. So I think those are all nice things. I always had the feeling, and now know with certainty from some new evidence, that MIT was on the wrong side of that fight through the whole time. That the MIT administration behind the scenes wanted that highway built, or wanted those highways built, to soften up the real estate so they could buy it cheaper. You can ask me afterwards what my evidence is, but I know for a fact that was, we felt they were the enemy. In fact, they were the enemy. We got 500 junior faculty at MIT and Harvard to sign petitions against MIT and Harvard demanding that they oppose the highways. Chester Hoffman was the primary organizer at Harvard, and Bob Goodman, who currently writes articles against casinos, who's in Western Mass, was the prime organizer along with Lisa at MIT, and they got 500 junior faculty who are getting stared at like, we'll screw you when it comes to tenure, and they had the guts to sign, and it was an important building block to the eventual success. So add up 1,500 plus 1,000, 2,500 units. If you count the damage to the adjacent neighborhoods, maybe it's 4,000 units of housing that are still occupied, by people, some of them still somewhat affordable. MIT failure to build enough housing for its own graduate students leaves this region. If MIT were providing 100% of the housing demand it's creating, that would be at least 7,000 units of housing. MIT has had a policy since 1962 that 50% of graduate students should be housed on campus. They stopped trying about 10 years ago. If they had kept to that standard, there'd be 2,200 units more housing on campus. That's almost exactly the number of Cambridge residences occupied by MIT graduate students. Now, I love MIT graduate students. Some of you know my students, very nice people. You have to live someplace. MIT's not providing the housing. What are you going to do? You have more money and you displace people in the community. And those 2,200 units are more than, or at least in the same order of magnitude as the housing units we saved from the wrecking ball at the hand of the highway. MIT, I've compared the two things. We had atom bombs called highways and urban renewal that destroyed whole neighborhoods, the likes of Rappaport in West End, after whom they named, they throw a few bucks at a university and they name an institute after him. He's the guy, by the way, Michael, you probably remember this better than me, it was Rappaport that intervened to block, when White went from liberal to right-wing, it was Rappaport who intervened in the rent control thing. The guy was a bad guy a long time ago, then and today. They named an institute after him at Harvard. So, a lot of housing units at stake. If MIT met its own standards, that would remove competition from 2,200 units. If it recognized that the market has changed and that a more appropriate goal than 50% would be 100%, that's 6,000 units. A lot of the displacement going on in Somerville is MIT graduate students who can't afford Cambridge. Some of them have come to me asking for help designing bus routes to get to Somerville easier. I said, I'm not going to help you. You want to chase out the few remaining affordable units in Somerville? Screw you. Organize against MIT and demand that there be a reasonable housing policy here. This is outrageous. Phil Clay, decent guy, has just put together a draft study on housing units. Very good data in it. very clear if you read the numbers that my numbers are, if anything, underestimates the 2,200 units and the 6,000 units. It's more like 3,000 and 7,000 are fair numbers. The recommendation, total whitewash. Build 500 units of housing. That's the number of people left on the waiting list last year, not counting all those who were discouraged. Add another 400 units for swing units, because the existing on-campus graduate student is the older stuff around. It's got to be rebuilt. And that assumes that it doesn't fall down before they rebuild it. A significant real number for swing housing would be a lot more than 400, probably 1,200 units. Doesn't look, very narrow mission given to fill, only look at graduate students. Doesn't look at postdocs, almost identical to graduate students in terms of the impact, or the generation of MIT of that need and the impact on the housing market. Doesn't look at freshman housing. I'm getting to be an old man. I attended MIT. I came here in 1957. Almost all the undergraduate housing was standing when I got here. It's getting old. No look at the need to rebuild that. All that housing demand is being dumped into what's called the market. The market for housing in Cambridge is about as much of a market as the price of bread in the former Soviet Union. The price of housing in Cambridge is set by MIT and Harvard. MIT and Harvard set the price too high on campus. It drives students into the community. Housing problem solved at no expense. This is outrageous stuff. We're part of this joint, and we should be demanding to do something here. I am very supportive of all the presentations we've had, and I really applaud all the efforts to catch the last minute crisis when people are actually being evicted. But we've got to intervene much further upstream if we want to impact this. And in Cambridge, MIT is a big part of the problem, and we're part of MIT. We ought to become a big problem to MIT and demand that they do a hell of a lot better than what they're doing. They got portraits of the goddamn Koch brothers hanging. I walked through the rain rather than walk through that goddamn corridor and have to look at those two shirts. They've got a daycare center that they slapped a name on the other end, and then they slapped their name at the Cancer Institute, where they said about trying to prove that cancer isn't caused by the pollution the Koch brothers produce. It's obscene what's going on in this institute. It really is outrageous. Where are the 500 people on the faculty signing petitions saying this is unacceptable? I mean, it's really a bad, bad thing. And we should do everything we can to help other communities, but we have an obligation to stand up in this community and demand that this change. It's really quite a bad situation. And it's not going to solve the whole problem, but it could be a significant beginning. Every one of these communities that are facing gentrification pressures has a nearby institution that is causing those pressures. They're not bad people. Trust New England Medical Center saved my granddaughter. I'm glad that there's a good medical facility there, but they're generating housing need that they should be helping to provide. If each institution in Boston, each university and each hospital were helping to build housing just for its own people, it could relieve and redefine what the market is. We can't just tinker with the market. We've got to restructure the market with some direct action by these institutions. I think if we began at MIT, we could, you know, get a new front going on this. This is going to take a lot of different initiatives. We've heard 5, this is a 6.
Thanks to our 6th panelist. As usual, Fred has as much to say as the rest of the room combined. I can appreciate that a lot. We had some reactions to that, and if we've got time to collect a couple of other questions, but you want to
just quickly. Yes. So Professor Barry Bluestone at Northeastern University, through the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, has definitely spoken about the demand that students create on local housing within the Greater Boston region. It's not just, of course, MIT or Harvard. It's multiple organizations and institutions that have this create this impact on demand. So that's one thing. The other thing is payments in lieu of taxes. I think that's sort of the big, that's one of the elephants in the room as well, is those institutions making payments to their host communities, and could include for housing. That's something that I know MIT and Harvard have talked about with Cambridge, and relationships to manage there, but pilots are, one of the key tools related to managing some of that issue. So just those are my two reactions.
Let me just take a couple of questions and we'll group them and see what reactions we have from the panel. Yes, Pat.
Thank you. I would just like to endorse what you're saying about Somerville. I think the epicenter is certainly Davis Square, but the real epicenter of change is Lowell Street. That station that probably is going to come, it's unbelievable, the transformation. I have lived there for, I don't know, 20 years almost, and what is going on is absolutely atrocious. I mean, you go around and you talk to your neighbors and you talk to people that you have known for many years. People are just, I mean, I cannot even, it's hard to explain. People are doing minimum work, and let's say a rent of a neighbor that was, let's say $900, and it's $2,100 from one change of, let's say, from June to August. And there are people moving in there, and you go around and you ask who they are. There are people from New York, from here, from there, and exactly what Professor said, they are all grad students or postdocs. It's everybody, or people related to the, let's say, the startup nucleus that's around Kendall Square. I mean, it is unbelievable, the transformation. And I think, I don't know, I mean, Cortatoni walks around and we talk to him, and I think he's good-hearted, and he probably have, his mind in the right place, but I don't think he has an inkling of what kind of action he as a mayor could support the people that have been there as he was growing up, as he became a mayor. So I think people in Somerville are being strangled by forces that we have no idea.
Thank you. Anybody with an actual question?
No, it's a statement. I'm sorry, we're in Cambridge.
Yes.
Yeah, Randy, but I teach at Rutgers in college. Living in the inbound land on the 95. I live in Highland Park, Fort Hill, right above it. When I moved there, was the arson capital of the U.S. and now the Gentrification Center of Boston. And I'm on the project review committee for our neighborhood. And Roxbury has more vacant land than any part of the city, both city-owned, privately. And city realty is really working hard to do it. And I wonder, and I'm teaching urban studies at RCHI, what can we do to make some of this land affordable? The private investors are coming in full speed on condos, and we have very little we can do to stop it. It's unbelievable. Building your 6-8-unit condos on a lot that used to have a single-family house. City, D&D wants to develop. We need to increase the tax base. Boston, they told us, Boston, needs more housing for people. But how do we get that built? And you look at what's happening in Jackson Square, Center Street, all around us, driven, as Fred was saying, by institutions like Northeastern, UMass, Longwood World. What can we do? And if I'm making policy on my project review committee, what can I push for this land so my students can afford it?
So anyone that wants to give a final comment, we try and answer that simple question.
Just say no. Just do everything you can to stop unwanted development where you don't want it. Fight for what you really want, which is affordable housing. In the 80s in the South End, which was a similar situation to your neighbors now, the DRA under Flynn proposed a policy of 1/3 low and moderate income housing and 2/3 market rate, right, for the remaining vacant land parcels. We just said no, and we got them to double the amount of affordable housing for low and moderate income people, tapping into the 1/3 market to subsidize the moderate income units. The numbers actually work. It was called the South End Neighborhood Housing Initiative. That I think would work now because the market is so out of control. But related to that is that we want to maximize nonprofit developers rather than for-profit, because they're the ones that you can negotiate with to plow, that. And it could be a minimum. It should be a minimum 2/3 was a minimum, so you could maximize beyond that in theory. So the tent city is 75% low and moderate, and the rest was market. The market was a compromise at the time, but it's better than Menino's plan, which was 10,000 units, of which it was 30,000 units, of which 10,000 was supposed to be low and moderate, and the low and moderate was trying to be 120%. Right, so that's clearly unacceptable. Walsh is putting together a plan right now. We need to be fighting to make sure that that does what it needs to do. And I think the jury is out on whether Walsh is going to discontinue Menino's policies, including encouraging mega development without any strings attached, or not. The jury's out, but we're going to have to unite around that. We probably can't do it at the neighborhood level alone, so you need to join forces with the groups around the table.
Anyone else want to make the last one?
That, I think the way that actually, I'm not really answering your question, but the way that, how it's in Chinatown is that, if there's public land, that's the majority of the housing should be affordable. And we know that it's probably not feasible to have it 100% affordable, but if it's public land, meaning the city owned or something, that should, at least 50% of it should be affordable housing. And that also, that affordable housing should be used as a guideline that's based on, the neighborhood, and not so much, about using the HUD guideline, the area median income, which, right now is, 94,000 a year. But whereas, but in Chinatown, the average income is 20,000, so when you use that standard to do affordable housing, it doesn't work, right? And if there's lands that are being leased, I think this is the problem. We talked about the BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and a lot of these, public land that's being leased right now, the lease fees, who knows where it goes to, but it's not coming back to the community. And we're saying that, if there's land lease fee, that should go to something, that's not a private entity, that's either, something like a community land trust or something, so that they can actually support in getting, permanently affordable housing that's community controlled.
Land banking was what I was going to say. It's sort of the dirty word is, to actually buy land and buy parcels, acquire all the vacant land and save it for social housing purposes. That's one of the big things to do. And I think to Michael's point is really pushing back and saying no, and saying that you need a certain provision for affordable housing and to be clear about what that means. And that would mean some local research on your part to figure out what it means for your local community.
In Jackson Square, mostly public land, there were charrettes and all kinds of planning meetings in the early aughts, 2000, 2001, probably 1,000 people involved, who said we want 100% affordable housing in Jackson Square. And certainly under no circumstances do we want any less than 70% affordable housing, because that's who lived within a half a mile of Jackson Square. And affordable housing was defined as being available to somebody making less than 80% of area median, which was the vast majority of Bostonians. It's not them, it's the vast majority. And so that has been nibbled away at, over the years since those original charrettes, and it'll be much less than, it'll be better than most developments, but I'll be surprised if it gets up to 50%.
It's not up to 50%.
Yeah. And so to say that you want a development that's in line with the area incomes, that's the only kind of development which doesn't gentrify, because it matches the area incomes. And the other thing I would say is, with resistance to rent increases and eviction, that can be really supported by the city short of rent regulation. If Mayor Walsh, for instance, was to weigh in and say, I'm going to insist that every landlord above a certain size sit down and negotiate with his tenant associations. If he did that, that would create a huge amount of pressure and some incentive on those owners to sell those buildings to nonprofits, buy occupied buildings where nobody in the neighborhood says NIMBY stuff because they're their neighbors already. And you can get a lot of housing outside the for-profit market.
There are 2 buildings in Fort Hill right now that are expiring these buildings. The contracts come up in the next year. It's Fort Hill Gardens was one, and then the other was used to be called Wrap Up to These, 51 apartments, 1, an extension for 12 years. It expires in 2014. And you Dennis Walsh was a condo developer, right? And they're row houses, so you know what's going to happen. The solution there is one innovative thing, is a bill that we've been fighting for since 6 at the State House. It would be a no-cost tool that would allow the city to require owners to renew their contracts with HUD and to convert vouchers into project-based vouchers to the state, which is a new state policy that opens it up as a possibility. That bill is sitting before the Joint Committee on Housing. The Senate chair strongly supports it. The House chair does not. We need Mayor Walsh to talk to the House chair. He hasn't done that yet. He said it at a meeting in Brighton. He supports the bill. He hasn't made that phone call. I need help from everybody in this room. This is going to be voting on the next 2 weeks in the committee, and we need your help. It would be great if MEPC could talk to them. It would be great if, the organizations here. There's one other thing I've got to, you mentioned Barry Bluestone. Barry Bluestone has been the principal ideological opponent of any kind of regulation on the market, even though his presentations make a perfectly elegant case for restoring rent control. Most powerful case for restoring rent control. He makes time and again with the Boston Foundation, but there's a barrier. He's got some kind of mental barrier. He just can't quite make the obvious conclusion. But it reflects that there's another front that you all can help with is fighting the ideological battle. This neoliberal ideology and framework is very deeply rooted and is reinforced by all the academic institutions, the Boston Globe, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, which is a trade group for the real estate, subsidized real estate industry. All of these institutes, the Boston Foundation, which fund those two groups? The Boston Foundation, they're all part of this, consistent ideological message that, it's they're kind of, no regulation is unthinkable. So if you go up to the State House, you're talking about terrorism. It's like, even though the referendum that repealed it was less than half of 1% statewide, less than half of 1%, but you can't, even though there's a very compelling argument. So we need help in fighting that battle as well. We need I think Fred's idea of organizing within the institution, doing a direct action campaign to force the institution to build housing for its own, but that would be a tremendous wedge in that ideological battle as well, because that would set an example to the other, institutional intellectual leaders of the other institutions to do the same. So there's another battle we have to wage.
Well, we have battles to come as well as drinks and some things to eat in the back. And I hope the conversations will continue for a bit tonight. I want to thank our panelists.